Language development in humans is a process starting early in life. Infants start without knowing a language, yet by 10 months, babies can distinguish speech sounds and engage in babbling. Some research has shown that the earliest learning begins in utero, when the fetus starts to recognize the sounds and speech patterns of its mother's voice and differentiate them from other sounds after birth. Typically, children develop receptive language abilities before their verbal or expressive language develops. Receptive language is the internal processing and understanding of language. As receptive language continues to increase, expressive language begins to slowly develop. Usually, productive language is considered to begin with a stage of pre-verbal communication in which infants use gestures and vocalizations to make their intents known to others. According to a general principle of development, new forms take take over old functions so that children learn words to express the same communicative functions that they had already expressed by proverbial means. Theoretical framework. Language development is thought to proceed by ordinary processes by of learning in which child acquires the forms, meanings and uses of words and utterances from the linguistic input. Children often begin reproducing the words that they are repetitively exposed to. The method in which we develop language skills is universal. However, the major debate is how the rules of syntax are acquired. There are also major approaches to syntactic development and an empiricist account by which children learn all syntactic rules from the linguistic input, and the nativist approach by which some principles of syntax are innate and transmitted through the human genome. The nativist theory proposed by Noam Chomsky argues that language is a unique human accomplishment and can be attributed to either millions of years of evolution or to principles of neural organization that may even that may be even more deeply grounded in physical law. Chomsky says that all children have what is called an innate language acquisition device. Theoretically, the LAD is an area of the brain that has a set of universal syntactic rules for all languages. This device provides children with the ability to make sense of knowledge and construct novel sentences with minimal external input and little experience. Chomsky's claim is based upon the view that what children hear, their linguistic input, is insufficient to explain how they come to learn language. He argues that linguistic input from the environment is limited and full of errors. Therefore, nativists assume that it is impossible for children to learn linguistic information solely from their environment. However, because children possess this LAD, they are in fact able to learn language despite incomplete information from their environment. Their capacity to learn language is also attributed to the theory of universal grammar, which posits that a certain set of structural rules are innate to humans, independent of sensory experience. This view has dominated linguistic theory for over 50 years and remains highly influential, as witnessed by the number of articles in journals or books. The empiricist theory suggests, contra Chomsky, that there is enough information in the linguistic input children receive, and therefore there is no need to assume an innate language acquisition device exists. Rather than uh, LAD evolved specifically for language empiricists believe that general brain processes are sufficient enough for language acquisition. During this process, it is necessary for the children to actively engage with their environment. For a child to learn language, the parent or caregiver adopts a particular way of appropriately communicating with the child. This is known as child directed speech (CDS). CDS is used so that children are given the necessary linguistic information needed from their language. Empiricism is a general approach and sometimes goes along with the interactionist approach, statistical language acquisition, which falls under the empiricist theory, suggests that infants acquire language by means of pattern perception. Other researchers embrace an interactionist perspective consisting of social interactionist theories of language development. In such approaches, children learn language in the interactive and communicative context. Learning language forms for meaningful moves of communication. These theories focus mainly on the caregiver's attitude and attentiveness to their children in order to promote productive language habits. An older empiricist theory, the behaviorist theory, proposed by B. F. Skinner, suggested that language is learned through operant conditioning, namely by imitation of stimuli and by reinforcement of correct responses. This perspective has not been widely accepted at any time, but by some accounts is experiencing a resurgence. New studies use this theory now to treat individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. Additionally, rational frame theory is grown from the behaviorist theory, which is important for acceptance and commitment therapy. Some empiricist theory accounts today use behaviorist models. Other relevant theories about language development include Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which considers the development of the language as a continuation of general cognitive development, and Vygotsky's social theories that attribute the development of language to an individual's social interactions and growth. Biological preconditions. Evolutionary biologists are skeptical of the claim that syntactic knowledge is transmitted in the human genome. However, many researchers claim that the ability to acquire such a complicated system is unique to human species. Non biologists also tend to believe that our ability to learn spoken language may have been developed through the evolutionary process, and that the foundation for language may be passed down genetically. The ability to speak and understand human language acquires speech production skills and abilities as well as multisensory integration of sensory processing abilities. One hot debated issue is whether the biological contribution includes capacity capacities specific to language acquisition, often referred to as universal grammar. For 50 years, linguist Noam Chomsky has argued for the hypothesis that children have innate language specific abilities that facilitate and constrain language learning. In particular, he has proposed that humans are biologically pre-wired to learn language at a certain time and in a certain way, arguing that children are born with a language acquisition device. However, since the developed since he developed the minimalist program, his latest version of theory of syntactic structure, Chomsky has reduced the elements of universal grammar which he believes are pre-wired in humans to just the principle of recursion, thus voiding most of the nativist endeavor. Researchers who believe that grammar is learned rather than innate, have hypothesized that language learning results from general cognitive abilities and the interaction between learners and their human interactants. It has also recently been suggested that the relatively slow development of prefrontal cortex in humans may be one reason that humans are able to learn language, whereas other species are not. Further research has indicated the influence of FOXP2 gene, FOXP2 gene stages 0 to 1 years of age. An infant mainly uses nonverbal communication, mostly gestures, to communicate. A newborn crying is only means of communication. Infants 1 to 5 months old have different tones of crying that indicate their emotions. Infants also begin laughing at this stage. At 6 to 7 months old, infants begin to respond to their own name, yell and squeal, and distinguish emotions based on the tone of voice of the mother and father. Between 7 to 10 months, the infant starts putting words together, for example, mama and dada, but these words lack meaning and significance. Verbal communication begins at approximately 10 to 12 months, and the child starts to imitate any sound they hear, for example, animal sounds. Nonverbal communication of infants includes the use of gaze, head orientation, and body positioning. Gestures are also widely used as an act of communication. All these stages can be delayed if the parents do not communicate with their infant on a daily basis. Nonverbal communication begins with the comprehension of parents and how they use it effectively in conversation. Infants are able to break down what adults and others are saying to them and use their comprehension of this communication to produce their own. 2 years of age. Verbal and nonverbal communication are both used at this stage of development. At 12 months, children start to repeat the words they hear. Adults, especially parents, are used as a point of reference for children in terms of the sound of words and what they mean in the context of the conversation. Children learn much of their verbal communication through repetition and observing others. If parents do not speak to their children at this age, it can become quite difficult for them to learn the essentials of the conversation. The vocabulary of a 1 to 2 years old should not consist of 50 words and can be up to 500 gestures that were used earlier or in development begin to that were used earlier or in development begin to be replaced by words and eventually are only used when needed. Verbal communication is chosen over nonverbal as development progresses. 3 years of age. Children aged 2 to 3 communicate best in turn taken style. This creates a conversational structure that makes it easier for verbal communication to develop. It also teaches patience, kindness, and respect as they learn from the direction of elders that one person should speak at a time. This creates interactional synchrony during their pre-verbal routines that shapes their interpersonal communication skills early on in their development. Children during this stage in their life also go through a recognition and continuity phase. Children start to see that shared awareness is a factor in communication along with their development of symbolic direction of language. This especially affects the relationship between the children and the caregiver. It is a crucial part of the self-discovery for the child when they begin to take ownership over their own actions in a continuous manner. 5 years of age. In this age group, children are still learning to form abstract thoughts and are still communicating concretely. Children begin to be fluent in connecting words, syllables, and linking words that make sense together in one thought. They begin to participate in short conversations with others. Stuttering can develop, generally resulting in slowed down speech with a few letter enunciation errors. F, V, S, Z. At the beginning of this stage, toddlers tend to be missing function words and misunderstand how to use verb tenses. Over time, they start including functional words, pronouns, and auxiliary verbs. This is the stage at which most children can pick up on emotional cues of the tone of adults' conversation. If negative feedback is distinguished by the child, this ends with fear and avoidance of the associated verbal and nonverbal cues. Toddlers develop the skills to listen and partially understand what another person is saying and can develop an appropriate response. 10 years of age. Much language development during this time period takes place in a school setting. At the beginning of the school age years, a child's vocabulary expands through exposure to reading, which also helps children to learn more difficult grammatical forms, including plurals and pronouns. They also begin to develop metalinguistic awareness, which allows them to reflect and more clearly understand the language they use. They therefore start to understand jokes and riddles. Reading is a gateway for learning new vernacular and having confidence in complex word choices while taken while talking with adults. This is an important developmental stage socially and physiologically for the child. This is an important development stage socially and physiologically for the child. School aged children can easily be influenced through communication and gestures. As children continue to learn communication, they realize the difference between forms of intentions and understand that there are numerous different ways to express the same intent with different meaning. 18 years of age. By the age of 10, the child's cognitive potential has matured and they can participate fully and understand the purpose of their conversations. During this time, the sophistication and effectiveness of communication skills increase and understanding of vocabulary and grammar increases as a result of education. Adolescents go through changes in social interactions and cognitive development that influence the way they communicate. They often use colloquial speech, slang, however, which can increase confusion and misunderstandings. An individual's style of interpersonal communication depends on who they are communicating with. Their relationships change, influencing how they communicate with others. During this period, adolescents tend to communicate less with their parents and more with their friends. When discussions are initiated in different channels of communication, attitude and predispositions are key factors that drive the individual to discuss their feelings. This also shows that respect in communication is a trait in interpersonal communication that is built on throughout development. The end of this adolescent stage is the basis for communication in the adult stage. Gender differences. Children versus adults. Language development and processes begin before birth. Evidence has shown that there is language development occurring antepartum. De Casper and Spence performed a study in 1986 by having mothers read aloud during the last few weeks of pregnancy. When the infants were born, they were then tested. They were they were read aloud a story while sucking on a pacifier. The story was either the story read by the mother when the infant was in the utero or a new story. The pacifier used was able to determine the rate of sucking that the infant was performing. When the story that the mother had read before was heard, the sucking of the pacifier was modified. This did not occur during the story that the infant had not heard before. The story for this experiment had shown that the infants were able to recognize what they had heard in utero, providing insight that language development had been occurring in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy. Throughout the first year of life, the infants are unable to communicate with language. Instead, infants communicate with gestures. This phenomena is known as pre-linguistic gestures, which are nonverbal ways that infants communicate that also had a plan backed with the gesture. Examples of these could be pointed at an object, tugging on the shirt of a parent to get the parent's attention, etc. Harding, 1983, devised the major criteria that come along with the behavior of pre-linguistic gestures and their intent to communicate. There are three major criteria that go along with a pre-linguistic gesture: waiting, persistence, and ultimately development of alternative plans. This process usually occurs around 8 months of age, where an appropriate scenario may be of a child tugging on the shirt of a parent to wait for the attention of the parent, who would then notice the infant, which causes the infant to point to something they desire. This would describe the first two criteria. The development of the alternative plan may arise if the parent does not acknowledge what the infant wants. The infant may entertain itself to satisfy the previous desire.